Maybe one of the biggest mistakes many Bible readers make is this. They assume the word Israel always means the same thing. And that one mistake can quietly blur entire chapters of Scripture. Because once you assume Israel is always the same thing, then prophets start sounding confusing. The New Testament starts feeling inconsistent. The words Jew, Israelite, Hebrew, Judah, and Israel begin to feel interchangeable. And before long, you are no longer reading the Bible on its own terms. You are reading a long covenant story, as if every century used the same labels in the same way. But that is not what happened. Not every Israelite was called a Jew. Not every use of Israel in the Bible points to the same reality. And Israel is not just a land or just a people or just a modern nation. Depending on where you are in the story, Israel can refer to a man, a family, a covenant people, a kingdom, a land, a prophetic hope, and today even a modern state on the world stage. That means this is not just a word study. It is a clarity issue. Because if you read these names too quickly, you can misread whole parts of God's story. You can miss why the kingdom divided. You can miss why exile changed identity so deeply. You can miss why Jesus is called the King of the Jews, while still being the Messiah of Israel. You can miss why Paul can call himself both a Jew and an Israelite without contradiction. And you can miss why the modern word Israeli is related to these older terms, but not identical to them. So today, we are going to slow down and untangle this carefully. We are going to go all the way back to Abraham, then Isaac, then Jacob, the man whose name became Israel. We will walk through the 12 tribes, the split between Israel and Judah, the exile that changed Jewish identity forever, the world of Jesus and the apostles, and the modern state of Israel. And by the end, the fog will clear, because this is not a random vocabulary problem. It is a story problem. And once you see the story clearly, the turns begin to make sense. To understand Israelites and Jews, you have to begin before either label was the main identity marker. You have to begin with a promise. The story starts with Abraham. God calls him out of his homeland and enters into covenant with him. That covenant includes land, descendants, and blessing. God is not merely choosing one individual for private comfort. He is beginning a people through whom he will reveal himself in history. The promise then passes to Isaac, and from Isaac to Jacob. Jacob is where the entire conversation starts to sharpen. Abraham is the father of faith. Isaac is the child of promise. But Jacob is the one whose new name becomes the name of a people. In Genesis 32, after a night of struggle, Jacob is given a new name, Israel. That moment matters more than many readers realize, because from that point forward, the descendants of Jacob can be called the children of Israel. That is the root of the word Israelite. This is the first thing you need to hold clearly, in the most basic biblical sense. An Israelite is a descendant of Israel, meaning Jacob. That is where the word begins. Jacob had 12 sons, and those sons became the heads of the 12 tribes. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin. Sometimes the lists are arranged differently because Joseph's inheritance can be expressed through Ephraim and Manasseh. But the main point remains the same. The covenant family became tribal. The tribal people became a nation, and that nation was Israel. At this stage in the story, the most accurate broad label is not Jew. It is Israelite. That matters because many people unconsciously pull the later word Jew all the way back into every early Old Testament scene. But if you were standing in the days of Jacob, or Moses, or Joshua, You would not be looking at a people already defined by the later historical identity of Jew in the fullest sense. You would be looking at Israelites, the descendants of Jacob, the 12-tribe covenant people. The Israelites grow from a family into a multitude in Egypt. What entered Egypt as a household in the days of Joseph grows into a great people over generations. Then comes slavery, then comes deliverance through Moses. God brings Israel out of Egypt. At Sinai, he gives them the law. This is where the identity of Israel becomes even richer. They are not only Jacob's descendants, they are also now the covenant nation delivered by God. That is a very important distinction. Israel is never just about bloodline in the Bible. It is about covenant. These people are united by ancestry, yes, but also by redemption, worship, law, memory, and divine calling. The God who brought them out of Egypt formed them into a holy nation. He gave them a priesthood, sacrifices, a tabernacle, appointed times, and commandments. So when Scripture speaks of Israel, it is speaking of a people formed by covenant life under God. And already, the word Israel is beginning to carry more than one layer. It's the name of a man. It is the name of his descendants. And soon it will also be tied to a land, because God had promised Abraham's seed a land, and the descendants of Jacob are moving toward that promise. That means early in the story, Israel can already point both to a people and to the land associated with that people. This matters more than it may seem, because one of the deepest reasons readers get confused later is that they expect one word to stay flat. But the Bible is not flat. It is a long covenant story. The same word can remain connected and still grow in meaning as history unfolds. After the conquest and the period of the judges, Israel asks for a king. Saul becomes the first king, then David, then Solomon. Under David and Solomon, the kingdom is united. All 12 tribes are together under one monarchy. Jerusalem becomes the royal center, and under Solomon, the temple becomes the great center of worship. In this period, Israel is still the united kingdom of the covenant people descended from Jacob. So, if you are standing here in the story, all 12 tribes belong to Israel. They are Israelites. The word Jew still has not yet become the dominant identity label it will later become. Then comes one of the most important turning points in the entire Bible. After Solomon, the kingdom divides. This split changes everything. The northern kingdom keeps the name Israel. The southern kingdom becomes known as Judah. The north includes 10 tribes. The south centers especially on Judah and Benjamin, with Jerusalem and the temple remaining in the south. Samaria becomes the capital of the northern kingdom. Jerusalem remains the capital of Judah. This is where many readers begin to lose the thread. Because before the split, Israel can refer broadly to the whole covenant nation descended from Jacob. But after the split, Israel often refers more specifically to the northern kingdom, while Judah refers to the southern kingdom. That means context now becomes essential. In some passages, especially historical ones, Israel and Judah are two separate political entities. In other passages, especially prophetic or covenantal ones, Israel may still be used in a broader sense for the people of God, descended from Jacob. If you miss that shift, the Bible can start feeling contradictory when it is really being historically precise. And this is also where the word Jew begins to rise. The word Jew comes from Judah. That is the second big key in this whole subject. Israelite is the older and broader ancestral term tied to Jacob, whose name became Israel. Jew is the later term that grows out of Judah. In the earliest stage, Jew refers in a narrower way to those associated with Judah, the southern kingdom, or the people of Judah. So here's the simplest way to say it. All people of Judah were Israelites in the broad ancestral sense, because they still descended from Jacob. But not all Israelites were Jews in that narrower historical sense, because the northern tribes were Israelites too, yet they were not the people of Judah. This is why the question cannot be answered with one careless sentence. If someone says Israelites and Jews are exactly the same in every period, that is too simplistic. If someone says they have nothing to do with each other, that is also false. The truth is more careful than that. Jews emerge from the larger story of Israel, especially through Judah. But Israelite remains the older, broader term. The tragedy of the divided kingdom only deepens the distinction. The northern kingdom of Israel falls into repeated idolatry. Prophets are sent, but the rebellion continues. In 722 BC, Assyria conquers the north. Many are taken away. Populations are displaced and mixed. The political structure of the northern kingdom collapses. Over time, the 10 tribes of the north lose much of their visible unity and clarity in history. This is where the idea of the lost tribes comes from. That phrase can be misunderstood, so it is worth pausing here. The tribes are not lost to God, but from the standpoint of later visible political and genealogical history. The old, clear structure of those northern tribal identities became difficult to trace. They were scattered into the movements of empire. History grew more complicated than the neat tribal map we see earlier in Scripture. Judah lasts longer. Jerusalem still stands. The temple still stands. The line of David still matters. Prophets continue to call the southern kingdom back to faithfulness. But eventually Judah too comes under judgment. In 586 BC, Babylon destroys Jerusalem, burns the temple, and carries many of the people into exile. And this is where something very deep happens, because exile does not just move people from one location to another. Exile reshapes identity. When the people of Judah are taken to Babylon, they have to preserve who they are without a king ruling in Jerusalem and without the temple standing in its fullness. They have to remember who they are in a place that does not reinforce their covenant life. They have to hold on to Sabbath, prayer, memory, law, and hope in the middle of dislocation. This is one of the hidden turning points in the formation of Jewish identity. Because what begins to emerge more strongly in exile is a people who are no longer defined only by living in their land or ruling their own kingdom. They are defined by covenant memory, sacred practice, the scriptures, and a shared devotion to the God of Israel. In exile, identity becomes portable. That is one of the reasons the Jewish people endure so powerfully through history. Their identity becomes deeply rooted in covenant life that can survive even when political structures collapse. This is why the word Jew grows in weight over time. It begins as a term tied to Judah, but it becomes the dominant historical identity of the surviving covenant people whose life continues through exile, return, and later dispersion. And that means something very important. The movement from Israelite to Jew is not a story of disconnection from Israel. It is a story of continuity through survival. It is what happened to Israel's visible covenant community in history after the northern kingdom was shattered, and Judah became the center through which the people's identity endured. That is the reveal many readers miss. The confusion is not really caused by bad vocabulary. It is caused by flattening the story. When you flatten the story, the turns feel inconsistent. But when you honor the story, the turns begin to make sense. Jew is not a random replacement word. It is the historical concentration of Israel's surviving covenant identity through Judah. After Babylon falls to Persia, Cyrus allows exiles to return. Some return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. This is the Second Temple period. Yet not everyone returns. Many remain scattered across the broader world. So now the covenant people exist, both in the land and in diaspora. This matters because identity is no longer tied only to one place. You can now be Jewish in Jerusalem, but also in Babylon, Alexandria, Antioch, or Rome. This is another reason the term Jew becomes stronger and more widespread. It is not just a local tribal label anymore. It is the living identity of the people who carry the covenant memory forward. They keep the scriptures, they gather for worship, they hold to their traditions, they mark holy days, they pass on the stories of Abraham, Moses, David, exile, and return. They remain the people of the God of Israel, even while living across different lands. By the time you reach the New Testament, this is the world you are entering. Jesus is born into the Jewish people. He is from the line of David. He is connected to the tribe of Judah. He is raised in Jewish life, in the rhythms of scripture, synagogue, temple, and covenant memory. Historically, Jesus is Jewish, yet he is also the Messiah of Israel. Do not miss how important that is. He is called King of the Jews, because that is the historical people among whom he has come. But he is also the fulfillment of the promises made to Israel, because Israel is the broader covenant story stretching back through Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, David, and the prophets. This is why the New Testament sometimes uses Jew and sometimes uses Israel or Israelites. The terms overlap, but they are not empty duplicates. Paul is perhaps the clearest example. In ordinary historical terms, Paul is a Jew, but he can also say that he is an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. That one statement alone untangles so much confusion. Paul does not see a contradiction between calling himself a Jew and an Israelite. Why? Because Jew speaks to his place in the historical covenant people of his day, while Israelite points to the deeper ancestral and covenant identity from the story of Jacob and the tribes. So yes, the same person can be both, but that does not mean the words mean exactly the same thing in every setting. And this is precisely where many Christian readers need to slow down, because if you do not distinguish these layers, then entire passages in the Gospels and Paul's letters begin to flatten. You may read the Jews in the New Testament as if the word is doing exactly the same work as Israel in every prophetic passage. Or you may read every use of Israel as though it simply means the later Jewish community in a one-to-one way. But the Bible is more textured than that. The same care applies when we think about the Samaritans. After the northern kingdom fell, the region changed dramatically. Populations mixed. A Samaritan community developed with its own claims to covenant heritage and its own worship center on Mount Gerizim. They held to parts of Israel's legacy, especially through the Torah. But they were regarded by many Jews of the Second Temple period as compromised or mixed in important ways. That tension in the New Testament is not random. It is born out of the divided kingdom and its long aftermath. When Jesus speaks to the Samaritan woman, that encounter carries the pain of centuries. Questions of worship, identity, covenant continuity, and sacred place are all in the air. That is why this topic matters. These words are not cold labels. They carry memory, fracture, longing, exile, return, and hope. Now, let us make the distinction as clear as possible. Who were the Israelites? The Israelites were the descendants of Jacob, whose name became Israel. In the broad biblical sense, they are the covenant people organized through the 12 tribes. Who were the Jews? The Jews were originally the people associated with Judah, especially the southern kingdom. Over time, the term broadened and became the common historical identity of the surviving covenant people whose life carried forward through Judah. Exile, return, temple memory, synagogue life, and later Jewish communal existence across the world. Are our Jews connected to Israel? Absolutely, deeply, historically, covenantally, the Jewish people carry forward the story of Israel in history. But were all Israelites Jews? No, not in the early and broader biblical sense. The northern tribes were Israelites too. And is Israel always the same thing in Scripture? No, nothing. And this is where everything opens up. Israel can mean Jacob, the man renamed in the night. Israel can mean the descendants of Jacob, the covenant people. Israel can mean the United Kingdom before the split. Israel can mean specifically the northern kingdom after the split. Israel can mean the land associated with the covenant people. Israel can mean the covenant people more broadly in prophetic hope. And today, Israel can also mean the modern nation-state established in 1948. One word, many layers, and that changes the meaning of the whole conversation. Because once you realize that Israel is a layered term, then many confusing passages stop competing with each other. You no longer force one meaning into every century. You begin reading with context. In Genesis, Israel may mean Jacob himself. In Exodus, the people. In Kings, often the northern kingdom in contrast to Judah. In the prophets, sometimes the north, and sometimes the broader covenant people in God's future purposes. In modern news, Israel usually means the present-day state. This is why careless reading creates confusion, not because the Bible is unclear, but because the whole story is longer than our assumptions. And this is also where many modern discussions go wrong. They collapse Israelite, Jew, Israeli, and Israel into one undifferentiated category. But those words are related without being identical. Jewish refers to an ethno-religious and historical identity tied to the Jewish people. Israeli refers to citizenship in the modern state of Israel. Many Israelis are Jewish, but not all Israelis are Jewish. Many Jews are not Israeli because they live in the diaspora. A Jewish person in London or New York is Jewish, but not necessarily Israeli. A Christian Arab citizen of the State of Israel may be Israeli, but not Jewish. And an Israelite in the days of Moses was neither a modern Israeli nor a Jew in the later historical sense. This is why precision matters, and the stakes are bigger than vocabulary, because if you read Israel carelessly, you may also read prophecy carelessly. You may read Jesus carelessly. You may read Paul carelessly. You may read modern events carelessly. You may build conclusions on a flattened reading of terms that Scripture itself uses with historical depth. This is where many people lose clarity. They think the confusion is small because it sounds like a simple word question. But the confusion becomes larger because it touches covenant, exile, Messiah, and the continuity of God's people through history. That is why slowing down here is not pedantic. It is faithful. The prophets make this especially clear in books like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Hosea, and Ezekiel. Israel and Judah sometimes appear side by side because the kingdom has divided. But the prophets also speak of reunion, restoration, healing, and a future in which what was broken is brought together under God's redemptive purpose. That means Israel in prophecy cannot always be reduced to the political northern kingdom alone. Sometimes it does point there, but sometimes it expands again into the wider covenant horizon. The prophetic voice can move from historical fracture to future restoration. If you do not listen carefully, you will miss when the term is narrow and when it widens again in hope. Take Ezekiel's vision of the two sticks, one for Judah, one for Joseph, or the house of Israel. The symbol acknowledges the split, but it also points beyond the split. God is not trapped inside Israel's fracture. He speaks into it. He promises beyond it. That means the divided history is real, but it is not ultimate. And this is why Jewish identity never viewed itself as disconnected from Israel's promises. The surviving Jewish community did not see itself as some unrelated group that appeared out of nowhere. It saw itself as carrying Israel's covenant memory, Israel's scriptures, Israel's worship, Israel's hope, and Israel's unfinished story through the historical line that endured visibly in the world. So when later history speaks of the Jews, it is not erasing Israel. It is describing the people through whom Israel's covenant story remained visible in ongoing history. That distinction is vital. It keeps you from making two opposite mistakes. The first mistake is to say that Jew and Israelite always mean exactly the same thing in every era. That is too flat. The second mistake is to say that Jews and Israel have little or nothing to do with each other. That is also false. The truth is richer. Jewish identity is historically rooted in the survival of Israel's covenant people through Judah. It is both continuous with Israel and shaped by later historical realities like the exile, the Second Temple period, diaspora, and rabbinic development. After the destruction of the Second Temple in AD 70, that endurance becomes even more remarkable. Once again, the people must preserve their covenant life without the temple standing at the center. Prayer, Torah, synagogue, memory, and communal practice become even more central. That is not a sign that the story has become less biblical. It is a sign that identity has again adapted in order to survive without losing its core. Temple can fall, empires can shift, populations can scatter, yet the people remain. That is one of the most astonishing parts of this story. The Jewish people are not just an abstract theological category. They are a living historical people who carried scripture, memory, worship, longing, and identity through centuries of displacement and survival. Their story is marked by suffering, resilience, preservation, and profound continuity. That is why Christian readers should speak carefully. These are not labels to toss around loosely. They are bound up with covenant, trauma, diaspora, temple memory, liturgy, survival, and hope. And there is something else here that should humble us. Sometimes what feels like contradiction in the Bible is actually complexity that we have not yet honored. Sometimes Scripture feels confusing not because it is careless, but because it is compressing a long historical journey into living language. The Bible speaks from inside real time. Terms stay alive as history unfolds. Their meanings deepen, narrow, widen, and shift depending on where you stand in the story. So careful reading is an act of reverence. When you hear the word Israel, you should ask, where am I in the story? Am I with Jacob the man? Am I with Moses and the people? Am I in the divided kingdom, where Israel means the north and Judah means the south? Am I in prophetic hope where Israel stretches into restoration? Am I in the first century where Jew is the common historical identity? Am I in the modern world where Israel means a nation-state? Those questions do not make the Bible more confusing. They make it more honest, and once you begin asking them, you start seeing how beautifully coherent the whole thing really is. Jesus is Jewish, yet he fulfills Israel's story. Paul is a Jew, yet he calls himself an Israelite. The Jewish people are the historical community through whom Israel's covenant memory visibly continued. The word Israel can move from person to people, to kingdom, to land, to prophetic hope, to modern nation depending on context. And suddenly, passages that once seemed blurred begin to open. The Gospels become clearer, the prophets become clearer, Romans becomes clearer, modern conversations become more careful. You realize the Bible was never careless with these terms. We were just reading too fast, and perhaps that is the deepest reveal of all. The problem was never just terminology. The problem was compression. We tried to shrink a long covenant story into a single static definition. But God did not tell his story in one flat layer. He told it through patriarchs, tribes, exodus, kingdom, division, exile, return, Messiah, diaspora, and ongoing history. That means the words are carrying the weight of real centuries. And that is why they matter. Israel is not merely a word. It is the echo of a man who wrestled in the night and walked forward, renamed. Israel is the memory of a people brought out of slavery. Israel is the ache of division after the kingdom split. Israel is the longing of prophets who saw beyond fracture. Israel is the name tied to land, covenant, worship, and promise. Israel is the wider story in which Messiah comes, and today Israel is also the name of a modern state whose existence has stirred history, politics, theology, and debate across the world. Jew is not just a later synonym, it is the historical identity through which the surviving covenant people carried that story forward through Judah. Exile, return, and long endurance across the ages. Israelite is not just an old-fashioned term. It is the broad ancestral covenant identity rooted in Jacob and the 12 tribes. Israeli is not the same as Jewish, though they often overlap. And once you see all of that, the confusion begins to loosen. So let us answer the central question one last time, but this time with full clarity. Are Israelites and Jews the same? Not exactly. In the broad biblical historical sense, Jews are deeply connected to Israel and carry forward the covenant story of Israel through history. But in the narrower historical sense, not every Israelite was a Jew, because Israel originally referred to the descendants of Jacob as a whole, while Jew arose later from Judah and became the dominant identity of the surviving covenant people. And what is Israel? Israel is one of the richest words in the Bible, because it refuses to stay flat. It is a personal name, a family line, a covenant people, a divided kingdom, a land, a prophetic hope, and in the modern era, the name of a state. One word, many layers, one covenant story, many historical stages. And maybe that is why this matters so much, because once you stop flattening the terms, you begin to see something even more beautiful than a correct definition. You begin to see the faithfulness of God across the centuries. A promise to Abraham, a people through Isaac and Jacob, a name given in the night, a nation delivered from Egypt, a kingdom established, a kingdom divided, a people judged, a remnant preserved, a return after exile, a Messiah born among the Jews, a gospel going out to the nations, a covenant story still remembered, still debated, still carried in history. That is not confusion. That is continuity under pressure. And there is something deeply moving about that, because the story does not stay tidy. It passes through fracture, loss, displacement, and long waiting. Yet the thread is never cut. The names shift in emphasis because history shifts around them, but God's faithfulness keeps moving through the whole story. So maybe the beauty here is not that the terms are simple. Maybe the beauty is that God stayed faithful through every stage they had to pass through. He stayed faithful when Israel was only one man. He stayed faithful when Israel was a family. He stayed faithful when Israel became a nation. He stayed faithful when the nation split. He stayed faithful when tribes disappeared into the storm of empire. He stayed faithful when Judah went into exile. He stayed faithful when the temple fell. He stayed faithful when the people lived far from home. He stayed faithful when Messiah came, and he stayed faithful through the long centuries in which memory had to survive through dispersion, prayer, study, and hope. That does not give us permission to read carelessly. It gives us a reason to read with awe, because behind these words are generations of tears, faith, worship, judgment, mercy, return, and survival. When you say Israelite, you are touching the story of Jacob's sons and the 12 tribes. When you say Jew, you are touching the story of Judah, exile, return, temple, memory, diaspora, and endurance. When you say Israel, you are stepping into one of the deepest covenant words in the entire Bible. So next time you open Scripture and see these names, do not rush past them. Pause. Ask where you are in the story. Ask what century you are standing in. Ask whether the text is speaking historically, prophetically, nationally, or covenantally. Because the more carefully you listen, the more the Bible begins to breathe. And the more it breathes, the more you realize this story was never as shallow as many people assumed. It was always deeper. It was always more layered. It was always more faithful. So no, Israelites and Jews are not simply the same word repeated in different places. But they are not strangers either. They belong to the same great covenant drama, though at different historical layers within it. The Jews emerge from the story of Israel through Judah and carry that story forward in history. The Israelites are the broader covenant people descended from Jacob. And Israel is the name that gathers the whole journey into itself, from one man's wrestling to a people's memory across generations. If this subject has ever confused you, do not be embarrassed. Many people have struggled with it because they were asking the right question, but expecting a small answer. And the answer was never small, because the Bible was never telling a small story. It was telling the story of a God who works through real people, real centuries, real kingdoms, real disasters, real returns, and real names that carry the weight of all of it. The story was not confusing because God was careless. It felt confusing because his faithfulness was unfolding across more history than we first realized. And once you see that, the names do not just become clearer, they become beautiful.